Welcome back. The Cabinet of South Africa has approved the publishing of the Criminal Law, Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Bill for public comment. The bill proposes repealing the current legislation that makes sex work a crime. Now, this comes after the government embarked on a series of consultative meetings with various stakeholders and interest groups, including religious leaders.
The bill has been widely welcomed as a step in the right direction because the current criminal status of sex work made those in the industry more vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Joining us now to discuss this further is the spokesperson of Sisonke National Sex Workers Movement, Yonela Sinqu. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
It's only a pleasure.
Now, we've witnessed in the past the challenges that sex workers go through. What does this new bill that proposes repealing the current legislation that, of course, makes sex work a crime mean to you? What change does this bring?
This gives great change to South African sex workers because, first and foremost, the current bill, which criminalizes sex work, actually means that sex workers who have been prostituted are prostituted under the Sexual Offenders Act, which then means that these sex workers are recorded in the sex workers, no, not in the sex workers, in the sexual offenders record. So that now limits anyone from taking other kinds of work, such as working with children or working with adults and so forth. Therefore, now this bill will remove those names from that list. And secondly, all cases against such people will be expunged. And this is for us a huge breather.
All right, let's talk about, I would like you to highlight or shed some more light on some of these challenges. You've mentioned on the one hand that the current situation would be that people who are involved in sex work are not allowed to do other work. What are some of the other challenges that people involved in sex work have had to deal with in South Africa?
The biggest challenge is abuse. We have opportunists who pose as clients and then further abuse sex workers, knowing very well that sex workers are going to be complacent to open cases against them. And the second challenge is the challenge of stigma and discrimination, especially when accessing healthcare facilities.
All right, and it's important that you mentioned this because we've just concluded the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which ran from the 25th of November to the 10th of December. And South Africa, of course, hasn't been very kind to women, unfortunately. So it's important that we have this conversation. Now let's talk about the new bill. Does it have provisions set aside for those who have been convicted of sex work?
The new bill is in line with the the National Strategic Plan, which is one of the issues addressed in the National Strategic Plan is the gender-based violence. And because sex work is majorly infiltrated by women, gender-based violence becomes the common issue. So therefore, with the National Strategic Plan, which is in line with the Constitution of South Africa, such issues are now addressed. And the criminalization of sex work was seen as the biggest contributor towards gender-based violence against women.
Really sad. I'm sure that this is also one of the popular angles to this, and that is the religious angle. A number of religious leaders have opposed this measure. The arguments, of course, are based on their religion. What are your views on the pushback by religious leaders?
We have always known that this is going to be an issue with religious leaders citing morality as their defense. However, gender-based violence and the criminalization of sex work is not about morality, nor is it about religion. It's all about a human rights violation, which has been tolerated for many, many years. I mean, since 1957, this law has been in place. And then in 2007, the buyer was also criminalized. And there's nothing moral about gender-based violence and a human rights violation. Those are issues which need to be addressed immediately in line with the constitution of the country.
Now let's talk about actual measures. I mean, decriminalization is one step, but we know that decriminalization alone doesn't really end a decrease in abuse and the killings of sex workers. So let's talk about what other practical measures can be put in place. Whilst this is on the one hand, this is happening, what other things can be done to prevent this from happening or reduce the cases?
Decriminalization is the first step in reducing those cases. We are not saying that decriminalizing sex work will definitely overnight end all the atrocities which sex workers face, but it will be a step in reducing such, because we're going to have at least more sex workers now accessing healthcare facilities, which will in turn reduce the spread of HIV and maintain people on medication. And second of all, we will at least have more people reporting cases, and we'll see more cases being prosecuted, as opposed to when a sex worker reports a case and then comes the question of what were you doing there, and then they pull back, because there's no way that you're going to say I am a sex worker, because that on its own is a criminal offense.
All right. Finally, I just want you to share, if you see this as dishonest, from the South African people and those who, of course, are clinging on to the religious or cultural or personal reasons for pushing back against these moves, the patronage for sex work is it still reasonably high, even while there's people who claim to push back against this bill?
Very much so. And interestingly so, the very same people at times who claim to be so anti-sex work are the biggest clients of sex workers. And because sex workers are such moral people who will not go and say, well, Pastor so-and-so and Reverend so-and-so are actually my clients, we let it go during the day, but we know that come evening time or come later on in a private setting, there's going to be a consensual transaction between that very person and the sex worker, which this person then claims to be against.
I mean, these are angles to this conversation that need to be, explored. And it's interesting because I was going to ask that the current position, does it criminalize the one patronizing the sex worker? Because the focus is on the sex worker, but does it currently criminalize the person who's patronizing the sex worker?
No, both of them are actually criminalized.
All right.
Both the buyer and the seller.
All right. Thank you very much for clarifying that. We certainly would be inviting you again as we have updates as regards this, but thank you very much for joining us.
Only a pleasure. Thanks to your watchers.
And of course, this is a genuine conversation that I believe needs to go across the continent, and that I feel like the involvement of religion and tribe and personal preferences in law should be completely kicked out. But of course, we'll see how this goes.
Is it really possible?
Possibility.
Is it really possible?
It's not.
It's the same way when we're talking about football and taking away your personal beliefs and separating your emotions from the game. I don't know how completely possible it is to totally separate
Might be hard,
both.
but we need to take steps further.
All right.